On a dry North African morning in 202 BCE, two armies drew up their lines on a plain that today is covered with Tunisian fields and small villages. In ancient times, the place was known as Zama, often called Zama Regia. Modern historians think it lay somewhere near the present-day town of Zama in north-central Tunisia, not far from rolling farmland and low hills. Back then, the dust on this ground would soon be darkened with blood. This plain was where the Second Punic War, the struggle between Rome and Carthage that had shaken the Mediterranean for nearly 2 decades, was about to reach its climax. On one side stood the legions of Rome, led by a young but battle-hardened commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. On the other side stood the army of Carthage, commanded by the same man who had brought Rome to the brink of ruin at Cannae years earlier, Hannibal, Barca. To understand how they came to face each other here, far from the fields of Italy, we have to step back. Years before Zama, Hannibal had marched from Spain over the Alps with an army that included war elephants, shocking the Romans by appearing in northern Italy from an unexpected direction. He had defeated Rome's armies at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, where he encircled and destroyed a vast Roman force in one of history's most devastating tactical victories. After Cannae, many in the ancient world expected Rome to fall. Italian allies wavered, some defecting to Hannibal's cause. Yet Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused to negotiate. The Republic raised new armies, adopting a more cautious strategy under generals like Fabius Maximus: avoid major pitched battles with Hannibal in Italy, harass his forces, and slowly choke his supplies. The war dragged on. Hannibal campaigned in Italy for years, destroying Roman armies when they came at him, but never quite forcing Rome itself to its knees. Meanwhile, a new Roman commander began to make a name for himself elsewhere. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had survived the disaster at Cannae as a young officer, took command in Spain. There, he defeated Carthaginian armies, drove the Barca family's power from Iberia, and won the loyalty of local allies. Confident, ambitious, and imaginative, Scipio proposed a daring idea. Instead of continuing to bleed against Hannibal in Italy, Rome should strike directly at Carthage's homeland in North Africa. It was a bold plan. Some in the Senate opposed it, but Scipio eventually won approval. He crossed the sea into Africa, landing near Utica, and beginning operations against Carthage and its ally, the Numidian kingdom. In Africa, alliances shifted. A Numidian prince named Massinissa, once closer to Carthage, threw his lot in with Rome. His expert cavalry would become a crucial part of Scipio's strategy. Carthaginian forces, under other generals, tried to stop Scipio and Massinissa, but they were beaten in battles like the Great Plains. Under severe pressure, Carthage recalled its greatest general from Italy. Hannibal, after 16 years of campaigning in Italian soil, was ordered to come home. One can imagine his feelings as he boarded ships with the remnants of his veteran army, leaving behind the land where he had known both triumph and frustration. In Carthage, he gathered what troops he could: his seasoned Italian veterans, citizen levies, mercenaries from distant regions, and what remained of his war elephants. The two men, who had never before commanded directly against each other, were now destined to meet on the fields near Zama. As dawn broke on that decisive day, each army made their final preparations. In the Roman camp, soldiers tightened the leather straps of their armor, checked the edges of their swords, and ate what might be their last meal. Their equipment was the familiar kit of the Roman legionary: helmet, body armor, rectangular shield, 2 pila, heavy throwing spears, and the short sword, the gladius. They formed into maniples, small units arranged with gaps between them in a checkerboard pattern. But today, those gaps were not an accident. Scipio had a specific tactic in mind. He knew Hannibal had brought elephants, and he intended to use the manipular flexibility to neutralize them. The legions formed in 3 main lines: hastati in front, principes behind, triarii in the rear, but with their maniples lined up so that lanes ran straight through the Roman formation. On the wings, Roman and allied cavalry deployed. On the right, under Gaius Laelius, were Roman horsemen. On the left, under Massinissa, stood the Numidian cavalry, light, fast riders whose skills had long been feared by their enemies. Across the field, the Carthaginian army took shape. Hannibal arranged his force in 3 infantry lines as well, but of very different character. In the front, he placed his mercenaries, Gauls, Iberians, Ligurians, and others, fierce fighters hired or persuaded to join his cause. Behind them stood a second line composed mainly of Carthaginian citizen infantry, men of the city and its immediate territories. At the very back, he placed his veterans from Italy, men who had fought with him for years against Rome, hardened by countless skirmishes and major battles. In front of all these, he deployed his war elephants, perhaps around 80 of them. Towering above the foot soldiers, their tusks sometimes capped with metal, they were meant to terrorize and break enemy lines. On the flanks, he stationed his cavalry, Carthaginian and allied horse on one side, more Numidian cavalry loyal to Carthage on the other. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows from men, horses, and elephants. A faint breeze stirred the dry grasses of the Numidian plain. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Carthage and its harbors. Somewhere across the sea lay Rome, watching and waiting. Before the signal to advance, the 2 commanders met. Ancient writers like Livy and Polybius tell us that Scipio and Hannibal arranged a brief conference between their armies. They rode out on horseback, accompanied by a few aides, and met in the empty space between the lines. What exactly they said to each other we cannot know with certainty, but later accounts imagine Hannibal warning Scipio of the mutability of fortune and the costs of war, and Scipio replying that Rome could not accept any peace that left Hannibal undefeated. It is a powerful scene, an older general who had seen Rome at its weakest, and a younger one who would see Rome at its strongest, facing each other calmly while tens of thousands of men waited within earshot, but too far to hear their words. Then the conference ended. They turned their horses and rode back to their own lines. Whatever had been said, there would be no peace without battle. Soon afterward, banners rose, trumpets sounded, and the armies began to move. Hannibal unleashed his elephants first. The beasts lumbered forward, urged by their handlers. Spearmen and light troops ran beside and between them. Behind, the first line of mercenary infantry started to advance, keeping pace. On the Roman side, Scipio had prepared his men for this moment. Trumpeters and horn players received their orders. As the elephants approached, Roman instruments blared loud, discordant sounds. Shouts and clashing shields added to the din. At the same time, light infantry, velates, ran ahead to hurl javelins at the elephants and then dart back into the safety of the lanes between the maniples. Some elephants, enraged and terrified by the noise and the pain of missiles, kept coming. Others began to panic. A few turned aside and bolted along the flanks, where they were met or diverted by Numidian horsemen or Roman cavalry. Some, more disastrously for Hannibal, turned back into Carthaginian lines, trampling skirmishers and even disturbing parts of his own cavalry. Those elephants that continued towards the Roman lines encountered not a solid wall, but gaps. The maniples parted as planned, creating corridors. The elephants lumbered into these channels where they were attacked from both sides by Roman soldiers, stabbing at them and their handlers. Many were brought down inside these lanes. Others broke through only to emerge behind the main Roman line, where they were isolated and easier to kill or drive away. The great psychological weapon of Carthage had failed to deliver the shattering blow Hannibal needed. The field now won was ready for the clash of infantry. Hannibal's first line, mercenaries from far lands, met the Roman hastati in a fierce struggle. Gauls with long swords swung in great arcs, Iberians with curved falcata blades slashed in quick, deadly movements, Ligurians thrust with spears. Roman soldiers met them with their own practiced discipline, throwing pila to disrupt shields, then closing in with short, stabbing sword strokes behind their large, curved shields. The fight in this front sector was brutal. The mercenaries had courage and skill. They had followed Hannibal through many risks to reach this final battle. The Romans fought with the weight of their city's fear and anger behind them, remembering Cannae and the long years of war. Step by step, under the steady pressure of Roman training and numbers, the first Carthaginian line began to give ground. As the mercenaries pulled back, often unwillingly, they collided with the second line of citizen Carthaginian infantry behind them. Confusion and anger flared. The citizens, less experienced than the veterans but proud of their status, resented having panicked mercenaries crashing into their ranks. Some refused to move forward to support them. In the crush, arguments and even fights broke out between Hannibal's own troops. Scipio saw the confusion in the enemy's front and center. He ordered his maniples to keep their cohesion, to move carefully into the gaps left by retreating Carthaginian units. The Romans pressed on, fighting now against the second line as they tried to disentangle themselves from their own comrades. Behind this increasingly chaotic scene, Hannibal still had his third line, the veterans from Italy. These were men who had stood with him at Cannae, at Lake Trasimene, and on countless marches and skirmishes. They knew the Romans as well as any non-Romans could. They had not yet been committed to the fight. When the front had been pushed back far enough and the second line had been partially merged or broken, Hannibal brought these veterans forward. Now, for the first time in the battle, the Romans faced fresh, solid resistance. The character of the infantry fight changed. Here, at this moment, the battle hung in the balance. The Romans had survived the elephants and pushed through two lines, but they were tired and disordered. The Carthaginian veterans were disciplined and battle-hardened. The fighting between them was intense and uncertain. Roman hastati and principes engaged with men who had once cut down their comrades in Italy. Shields slammed together, swords stabbed, spears thrust. Neither side gave way easily. The lines locked, swayed, and reformed. In places, small groups became isolated, fighting back to back. Dust and shouted commands filled the air. Scipio knew that if this became simply a contest of endurance between his infantry and Hannibal's veterans, the cost would be terrible and the outcome unclear. But he was counting on another piece of his plan, the cavalry. On the flanks, while the infantry fought, Roman and Numidian riders had clashed with Hannibal's horsemen. On one wing, the heavier Roman cavalry under Laelius had driven their Carthaginian counterparts from the field. On the other, Massinisa's Numidians had matched and then overcome their Numidian rivals loyal to Carthage. Instead of chasing the broken enemy horse too far, the Roman commanders gathered their squadrons, turned them, and led them back toward the main fight. At first, their return would have appeared as distant movement on the horizon, small, dark, moving shapes against the bright African sky. Then, the thunder of hooves grew louder. Men in the rear of Hannibal's formation started to turn their heads, uneasy. Suddenly, cavalry were upon them. Roman and Numidian riders crashed into the rear and flanks of Hannibal's last line. Exhausted infantry who had been focused entirely on the enemy ahead now found swords and spears striking from behind. Numidian javelins rained down into the packed ranks. Confusion exploded. Some units tried desperately to turn around and form a new front. Others broke entirely. From Scipio's perspective, this was the decisive moment. He urged his infantry forward once more. From the front, legions pushed. From behind and the sides, cavalry hacked into Carthaginian ranks. What had been a hard, even fight turned into a collapsing pocket. For some of Hannibal's veterans, there was no thought of surrender. They fought on where they stood, even as they were surrounded. Others threw down their weapons or tried to flee.
In the swirl of dust and fear, it became impossible to maintain order. Hannibal, seeing that the battle was lost, did what Darius had done at Gaugamela. He saved himself and a small corps of followers. With his army disintegrating around him, he withdrew from the field, riding away toward the interior of Africa. He would live to advise Carthage in defeat and later find service in foreign courts, but his days of commanding vast armies against Rome were over. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the plain of Zama, today's Zama region, was strewn with bodies. Roman and Carthaginian dead lay together in twisted heaps. Broken shields, snapped spear shafts, and dropped helmets littered the ground. The cries of the wounded mixed with the cawing of birds beginning to circle. Roman soldiers, bloodied and exhausted, stood among the wreckage. Some leaned on their shields, catching their breath. Others tended to their wounded comrades, giving water and makeshift bandages. Officers moved through the ranks, trying to re-establish order amid the aftermath. Scipio walked or rode across the field, looking at what his victory had cost. He had destroyed Hannibal's last great army. Carthage no longer had the strength to continue the war. This would be remembered as the battle that ended the Second Punic War and secured Rome's dominance in the western Mediterranean. In Carthage, news of Zama would come like a hammer blow. The city's council, seeing no alternative, would have to accept harsh peace terms, surrender its overseas possessions, give up most of its fleet, pay heavy indemnities, and agree not to wage war without Rome's permission. Carthage would remain a city, but not the kind of power it once had been. Scipio would return to Rome in triumph, entering the city in a chariot beneath laurel wreaths, hailed as the man who had avenged Cannae and broken Carthage's power. He would earn the honorary name Africanus for his victory in Africa. Yet even in triumph, the cost of such wars was etched into the memories of all who had seen them. Hannibal, the commander who had outmaneuvered and outthought so many Roman generals, would spend the rest of his life as a wanderer and advisor to foreign kings, always hunted by Rome's fear of his genius. Carthage, still alive, would be destroyed entirely in a later war, decades after Zama. Rome, now supreme in the western Mediterranean, would be drawn into new conflicts and conquests that would eventually change the Republic into something else entirely. And the field where it all turned, the plain of Zama, was left to heal. Over the centuries, the exact location of the battle was forgotten and then half remembered. Towns rose and fell. The Roman Empire came and went. The region became part of Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, and French domains before becoming the independent nation of Tunisia. Today, near Zama and other small towns, people farm the land, raise families, and live ordinary lives. Archaeologists walk these fields with trowels and GPS units, searching for the faintest traces of spearheads or lost coins. Historians study the texts of Polybius and Livius, piecing together the movements of armies from fragmentary descriptions. Teachers point to maps, showing students a spot in Tunisia and saying, here, more or less, is where Hannibal and Scipio decided the fate of two ancient superpowers. From the perspective of those living there now, Zama is not Zama Regia, it is simply home. Yet, buried in the soil beneath modern wheat and olive trees, the memory of that day in 202 BCE still lingers, a reminder that even the quietest landscapes can once have echoed with the clash of empires, the roar of elephants, the thunder of cavalry, and the unrecorded cries of thousands of men whose names have been lost, but whose fate shaped the story of the ancient world.